All right. Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you all to our first Chalkbeat Ideas event. Chalkbeat is a nonprofit newsroom focused on education and efforts to improve education in 8 communities and around the country. And we're really excited about this new project, which is designed to explore the biggest questions facing the education world right now. So I wanted to welcome everyone and introduce our Chalkbeat Ideas editor, Matt Barnum. Matt is a Chalkbeat veteran. He spent 6 years with us at Chalkbeat as our first national reporter. He helped define our brand of national coverage and produced a body of award-winning journalism that makes complex topics clearer to our readers. 2 years ago, he joined the Wall Street Journal as a K through 12 education reporter, and now he's back with us, helping us make sense of a really fascinating moment in education. So I'm excited to turn things over to Matt for a great conversation.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to everyone for being here. Being an ideas editor is kind of a dream job for me because I'm a nerd and I'm really interested in thinking and writing about schools and improving schools. And I'm thrilled to see dozens of other people in this room who are also nerds and who are also interested in writing and thinking about schools. And that's the point of our new section, Chalkbeat Ideas. So I'm really thankful to you all for joining us, and I'm thankful to our panelists who I'll introduce in a moment. Before we get to our main event, though, I do want to give a special thanks to our event sponsor, which is the AIM Institute for Learning and Research. We're going to hear a brief word from our sponsor, Kristen Wynn, who's the head of the AIM Institute. She has served in education for 20 years, most recently as the state literacy director for the Mississippi Department of Education. Kristen.
Thank you, Matt and Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kristen Wynn, head of AIM Institute for Learning and Research, and it's a privilege to join this important conversation that takes us beyond the headlines and really into the hearts of what both data and daily classroom experience reveal about learning recovery. At AIM, we believe that understanding learning loss begins with understanding how learning happens, right? For 20 years, our nonprofit organization has worked to bridge the gap between the science of reading and the daily practice of teaching. What we've learned is that recovery isn't simply about catching up. It's about building forward, creating stronger systems of teacher knowledge, instructional coherence, and student engagement that can endure long after crisis fades, right? So when we look at Dr. Oster's findings, one theme is clear. Data alone doesn't drive recovery. People do. Behind every data point is a teacher making meaning of it, a student experiencing it, and a leader deciding how to really respond. Across our partnerships in districts and with state departments of education nationwide, we see that the schools making the fastest gains are those where teachers have deep understanding of how students learn to read and think critically. They're not just extending learning time, they're transforming how knowledge is taught, transferred, and applied. That's the shift from remediation to reconstruction and how lasting recovery really began. So, as we unpack this new data today, and I'm super excited about it, I invite us to think not only about what was lost, but about what we can gain: deeper instructional alignment, stronger teacher preparation, and a shared commitment to connecting the science of learning and the science of reading to the art of teaching. That's the work AIM is leading every day so that every student, regardless of background, has the opportunity to thrive. So thank you. Thank you to Chalkbeat and Matt for launching this ideas series and creating space for such an important discussion about how we move from learning loss to lasting learning.
Thank you, Kristen. So to give folks a few rules of the road of how we're going to approach things today, we're going to start with a presentation of new data and new insights. Then we're going to have a conversation between me, Emily Oster, and another panelist who I'll introduce shortly. And then we'll have time for audience Q&A. After the presentation, you all can feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and I will ask as many of them as I can. And I also have some pre-submitted questions that I'm going to use. Okay, we're going to do our presentation now, and I'd like to introduce Emily Oster, who hardly needs an introduction. In my neighborhood in Brooklyn, Emily, I'm pretty sure you're a celebrity. In Prospect Park, I think people would either ask for your autograph or ask how long they're allowed to keep their kid on the iPad without
Right.
permanently damaging them, probably both. But more officially, Emily Oster is the CEO of Parent Data, a professor of economics at Brown University, and a New York Times bestselling author. Emily.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you, Kristen, for sponsoring this. And I'm just absolutely delighted that we can do this. Getting to know Matt during the pandemic was really a treat, and he's one of my favorite people to talk to about ideas. And so I'm glad we get to take some of that conversation in front of other people. All right, so let me share my screen. I will be brief because I know that presentations on Zoom are best done in brief. So I'm going to try to go through today sort of 5 insights about learning loss that I think, some of which I hope are new to this audience. I want to say first, the data that we use for this comes out of the Education Data Center, which is an effort involving me and Claire Halloran, who I know some of the people on this call know well, to organize and clean the state level assessment data and in a way that it is sort of widely usable. So I'm going to show you some things that we've gotten out of these data, but if this data, the state summative assessment data is something that you are using in some way, we would love to hear from you. We would love to make it easier for you to use that data. We've done a lot of work to make it clean and well documented and hopefully and quickly available to people. So that's my plug for if you need this data, tell us so we can get it to you. All right, so I want to start with just I want to jump right in and start with the question of how easily we can track what's been going on post-pandemic. So I think there's a lot of discussion about pandemic learning loss and pandemic learning recovery. And one of the reasons that at the Education Data Center we got most excited about the state level data is that it is really our best comprehensive way to track over time what is happening in terms of learning loss and recovery. We see it much more frequently with many more students than we see the NAEP. And so this is kind of our best kind of tracking data, even though it's not comparable across states. But one of the features of this data that's tricky is that states often change their tests. So I just wanted to start with the question of to what extent can we actually use these data to track over time? And so when we look at English language arts, they're about 40% of the states have an ELA baseline that is after the pandemic. So when we think about our ability, both short and long term, to track recovery post-pandemic, I think it's worth saying that for, closing in on half of the states, we actually are sort of losing our ability to track that over time. Now, there are a lot of reasons that states change their tests, and so I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't, but I think it's worth keeping in mind when we think about the value of these data, that as we update these tests over time, we are going to lose our ability to kind of continue to track in a comparable way. This is what ELA looks like, and this is what math looks like. There have been fewer changes in math over this period. The second thing I want to talk about is what has happened big picture post-pandemic. So we all know that there were large losses in terms of learning or put differently, large reductions in state test scores and proficiency rates between the 2019 state test scores and the 2021 test scores. So if we all cast our minds back to the 5 years, you probably remember that in the spring of 2020, more or less no states did. In fact, no state did a summative assessment in 2020 because everybody was closed. But in 2021, we started to see those come in from most states. And so there was this kind of initial decline decline in test scores between the 2019 data and the 2021 data. And so this is a list of states where we have 2019, 2021, and 2025 already released. And this is only states where the test is comparable across those years. So we are not showing you anything where they change the test or change the cut scores, because that would not be interesting. That would not be comparable. And what you can see here is on the red dots, those are the declines between 19 and 21. So for example, between 2019 and 2021 in math, Virginia's proficiency rate declined 32 percentage points, which was a very large decline. Nobody else declined that much, but there were very consistent declines between 19 and 21 across all of the states in the data. And then the blue dot to the right is the change between 19 and 25. So you can interpret this line as basically the like amount of recovery. And so you can see that in math, basically every state has recovered, and we're kind of edging towards some states being sort of close to where they were in 2019. Although I will say that actually the recovery in math has still not been complete. There are relatively few states where we're actually seeing them not only get back, but exceed, Mississippi being a sort of core example. When we look at ELA, the picture is a little more all over the place. And in particular, we see some states in ELA. This is, again, the same picture, but we see some states which have sort of wildly exceeded their 2019 data. So Mississippi, Iowa, they're all looking Tennessee are all looking much better in 2025 than they were in 2019, even though they had that initial decline. And then we have other states, Massachusetts, Minnesota, where actually they look worse in 2025 than they did in 2021. So that not only was there a decline, but the decline has basically continued to the present moment. So for us, this is kind of one sort of interesting insight or interesting comparison to kind of think about here is the sort of patterns of recovery across states, but also the differences in the consistency in math and ELA and like how we might understand that. Okay. Third thing I want to talk about is school closures, everyone's very, very favorite topic. And so to look at this, what we did was we divided schools into sort of 4 groupings. Schools that were basically not at all in person over the 2020-2021 school year. Schools that were about up to 40% of the time in person, 40 to 100%, 40 to 99 in person, 100% in person. So you can sort of think of these groups as being kind of roughly quartiles. And then we looked within state. So this is actually comparing across school districts within a given state. So we're exploiting situations in which, because these decisions were made at the school district level, not necessarily at the state level, we're exploiting cases in which some districts in the state were in person and some districts were not. And so what you can see is that when we look between 19 and 21, these first dots over here are showing you how much the decline there was in math test scores between 19 and 21 across these groups. And what you see when you look at that is you see that the places that were less in person, had more remote schooling, declined more. This is a well-established fact. We've looked at it, and we know this to be true. And the more in-personness you had, the less you declined, although it's worth saying everybody goes down. Over the past several years, as we have seen recovery, we have seen those numbers come back together. So the differences now are largely insignificant and much, much smaller. So another way to say that is that there was this very large decline in the not in-person places, but they've caught up more quickly. We see a very similar pattern in ELA here. 2 other things I want to highlight about recovery. And I want to be mindful of time, but we can come back to some of these in conversation if people want. So 2 other things I want to highlight about recovery. So one is, this is the same graph, but looking across race and ethnicity. In the case of race and ethnicity, by and large, we see sort of pretty similar declines. So actually the differences here are quite small at the beginning and similar levels of recovery. So we're actually not seeing a lot of we're not seeing a lot of distinction between racial groups in declines and recovery. Where we do see some interesting differences, and Matt and I talked a lot about this, I think we'll talk more about it, is in gender. So when we look at female versus male students, we see that not only did female students decline more between 19 and 21, but they have recovered more slowly. So actually, there was a gap in the kind of amount of decline in the first place, and then that gap has widened over time. So girls lost more and recovered less. And I think that is if you look across many different demographic cuts, that's the one that is pulled out as the most significant. All right, final thing I want to show you before we move to questions is how do the state test scores compare to the NAEP? So here we're moving past the pandemic and just looking at 22 to 24. So this is all post-pandemic data. And we're looking at, on the horizontal axis here, how much the NAEP scores changed between 22 and 24 in the state. And then on the vertical axis, how much the state test scores changed. So what you can see is that this is the fourth grade, there is a positive correlation here. So in general, when the NAEP scores have gone up more, the state test scores have gone up more. But on average, the NAEP scores are probably going up less than the state test scores are. So the state test scores tend to sort of improve more relative to the NAEP scores, and the correlation is pretty. I mean, the correlation here is 0.4, basically. So it's correlated, but there's a fair amount of noise, and we talk about why we might see that noise. In the 8th grade data, we see a very similar thing, although the correlation is smaller, and there is one very significant outlying point, which is that in the 8th grade state test scores in Illinois, there was a 20 percentage point increase in proficiency, despite claims that the test is the same and the cut scores are the same. And the same NAEP in that year showed basically a 0. So that is an example of a place where when I look at that as a person who does data, I wonder if there's something more we might need to understand about one of those two tests. That on many of these other differences, you could sort of chalk up to differences in kind of noise. That would be a pretty surprising. That difference is pretty surprising. And so I will leave you with that insight. And yeah, so Matt, let's talk.
Yeah, let's do that. And I would also like to introduce our other panelist, who is Dr. Ashley Bowling. She is a principal of Florence Middle School in Alabama. She was named Alabama's Assistant Principal of the Year in 2022 and is the principal-elect of the Alabama Association of Middle School Principals. Ashley, thanks for joining us. Are you in the middle of a school day?
I am in the middle of a school day. So we are in Northwest Alabama and we are in harvest season. And we have what is called Corn Day today, where all the students are getting roasted corn along with their lunch today. And so, yeah, we're right in the middle of lunch in a middle school.
Thanks for fitting us in. I
Yeah,
wanted to start
absolutely.
with you, Ashley, and say, after watching Emily's presentation, what jumped out to you as the most interesting or the most surprising thing?
The most interesting thing to me is the girls. Why girls were so far and have not recovered as much. Another thing interesting to Alabama is this is the 2020 was supposed to be our first year to give our new state assessment. And then we gave it in 21. So we didn't know what our new state assessment would look like. And then we gave it post-COVID. So it's interesting to see that post-learning and post-recovery numbers right now, but really the girls stood out the most to me. And why do you think that is? I mean, why? Just day-to-day practice. I just, there were significant gaps there across the board for male and female.
Yeah. Emily, we've talked about theories, but I don't think we have really nailed it, or anyone has, right?
Yeah, I don't think we've nailed it. I mean, I think I was, if it were only the initial decline, I might have said girls are benefiting more from school than boys because we know there are, ways in which schools are designed differently that maybe that maybe serve girls better than boys. So maybe the loss of school was a bigger deal, but the slower recovery, I think, doesn't really align with that. And so I'm a bit at a loss. I think it's something we could dig more into the data to understand more, but I don't, from just that data, I'm not seeing why.
And I don't
Yeah.
think anyone was really predicting this during the pandemic, So I think it's like kind of a really remarkable societal phenomenon, and we've seen it on a bunch of different tests. There was also just a study of it showed up in collegiate grades. So it's pretty striking. There was a question in the chat about how you're defining learning loss, Emily. And so let me just say my understanding of it is everything is essentially a comparison to 2019 in proficiency percent share of students who are proficient on 3rd through 8th grade math and or reading. Is that right?
That is exactly right. Yes.
And we should note that it's comparing different groups of students over time.
Yeah.
So the cohort of 3rd through 8th graders is different than the cohort of, in one year than the next. So that's something just to keep in mind. Can I ask both of you why we think there has been more consistent progress in math than in reading? We see that in the state scores, and we also see that on NAEP where, excuse me, reading scores have declined.
I don't know. The sort of influence of school on math is more significant. It's in many kinds of data than it is on reading. So if you look at like the differences in test scores in charter schools, kind of thing, those often show up more in math than in reading. I think what's puzzling to me about the reading is just there's clearly something very different happening across states. Math sort of looks like everyone's kind of clawing their way back, and some places are doing a little better than others. Reading sort of looks like some people kind of figured it out and some people didn't. And of course, if you look at those states, you pull out phonics in your head, from a few of the outliers, but I'm not sure how consistently that organizes the whole picture, as opposed to just saying, well, that would explain why Mississippi and Tennessee and South Carolina are doing well. So I don't know, Ashley, I'm so curious if you have a sense.
It's interesting to see because when students came back from COVID, we had to teach across ethnicity, gender, and content how to be a student again. And a lot of it, I think, it was all virtual, and we were set up in Alabama. We were the second virtual school to middle school in the state of Alabama. So we had the platform, but when they came back face to face, and we came back really soon, as soon as schools could open, we came back in a hybrid model, and we had kids in the building every day, not to full capacity, but kids were at least here 3 days a week. And reading is I have to be willing to engage in a productive struggle with you and show you openly that I have some deficits. And we struggle with that in middle school all the time because they are not going to cash in their social card to show you that I can't read on grade level with my peers. And math, I can start with manipulatives, then I can go to pictorial, and then I can help you get to abstract. And we saw the gap in math so much that the whole class was walking through those steps, and reading was kind of all over those that did their work while they were home and those that didn't. And so we're still struggling with reading right now because you have in Alabama, the same set of standards from the time you learn to read, and that shifts from learning to read to reading to learn from 3rd grade to you graduate. We just changed the complexity band of what we're asking at each level. So, I mean, I definitely see it, but I know that our first hurdle was teaching students to be students again.
Emily, can you pull back up the girls versus boys? We've got a couple questions just to look at that to make sure folks are understanding that correctly. There was also a question, were states that have cut score changes included in the comparison between change in NAEP versus state assessment? The answer to that
No.
question is no.
No.
There was a question of, so actually let's just all look at this girls versus boys chart to understand it again. So girls fell 9 percentage points in 21 relative to 19. They're down 6 percentage points relative to 19, whereas boys are down 3. And of course, we should say these are just averages.
These are averages across both ELA and math.
Right. So it's not like every girl or every boy looks the same.
Yeah.
There was a question of, is there a way to know if the female-male discrepancy was beginning to show up prior to COVID, thinking about the effects of social media?
That's super interesting. Yeah, it definitely is a way to do that. I think it would be interesting to look at the trends in these. Like we could do that. I haven't to look at the trends sort of by gender before, maybe beginning in 2012, which is kind of when you would date the social media, to see whether this is just a continuation of it. Yeah, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna do that, Matt. But now while we're on the call.
Yeah, a good plan. Yeah, and I don't think we have seen that much. And we're talking about third through eighth graders. I
Yeah.
think on some, when I've looked at it before, I don't think you see something immediately show up. There was another question about girls versus boys versus about, based on school closures. We haven't looked. You haven't looked at that,
I
right?
haven't looked at that cross now.
Yep. Um, let's talk about the school closure finding briefly. Ashley, can you just speak to like what effects school closures like how your school dealt with the pandemic era closures and like what effect that had on the school?
Oh gosh, it's like walking down a nightmare memory lane. We closed like on Friday, we closed and thought it might be for just 2 weeks. And then initially it was the rest of the year. And so not only do you think about academics, you think about we were the safe place that a lot of our students knew at least two meals were coming home that day. And we were sending a lot of meals home with families in the afternoons anyway for dinner meals, just something we have always done because of our demographic. And we kind of had to think about how we're going to feed our families. And so my district bought a food truck. And so the administrators and teachers volunteered and we took food to the different communities and all our students could get food. And then we had to shift away to get devices and while we had devices for every student one-to-one, our elementary students did not take them home. Middle school did. And so how to get devices in their hand, how to turn our schools into internet hub spots. So if they did not have internet at home, they could come and do their work at school. The other thing was the adults. I mean, teachers go into education because we're social creatures, and then we lost that family, that unit. And so we started doing virtual faculty meetings and virtual check-in with our students, and we learned a lot about just the dynamic of how much school meant to our students outside of academics. But yeah,
When did you fully reopen schools? Was it in the fall of 2020 or later than that?
So we opened in a hybrid model, the fall of 2020, and then the next year everybody back. So the hybrid model was basically we split our students and they came to school one full day, like they either came Monday, Wednesday, or they came Tuesday, Thursday, and it was a split on Friday.
So, Emily, you obviously were someone who was making the case during the height of the pandemic that schools are really important and that we need to reopen them. Looking at the data that you've done now, showing that there is this gap, but it's relatively small, like, what do you make of that thinking back?
mean, I think that, the way that I would interpret what we see here is that that it really mattered for like how students learned in that school year, what happened, and that then there was the ability to recover some over the next, set of years. So there's a kind of worst case scenario version of this where like the places that were fully closed are always going to be 8 percentage points below. And we sort of don't see that in the aggregate data. I think what's tricky and isn't actually exactly what this measures is, as you said, we're sort of moving the cohorts, right? So there's a cohort of kids who like were in the eighth grade in, that school year who lost, say 10 percentage points or whatever. And that group is kind of leaves and then are replaced by some other people. So but that group, there's like a real loss there. And I actually think, echoing what Ashley said, some of this, the thing I worry most about, the groups I worry most about are actually kids who like worked in 10th grade or 11th grade and were kind of tangentially attached to school in the first place, who then school didn't really become that important and then they left and they never came back. And those people maybe aren't going to graduate from high school. So I think there's more that I would like to understand about some of those sort of longer term impacts of the kids who like lost the time and then probably aren't going to get it back later. But I think the glass half full part of this is it does look like sort of post-pandemic, like people are kind of able to pull it back. Virginia is not still 32 percentage points down in their in their math test scores. And that is good. But I still think we should have opened schools.
Yeah. Matt, can I piggyback on what Emily said right there?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's interesting that you talked about cohort of students, because we think about not only, I mean, time was something you can never replace. And so it was what time section of their educational journey that this occurred. So like right now, my son is an 8th grader. So he missed that 2nd grade year where those foundational math skills, and developmentally, that's where his brain was. And so then we brought him back, let's say 4th grade full time. Well, he's in a different developmental, and he missed all of that ability to absorb that concept and that brain development time. And so right now we have a group of 8th graders that are still struggling with multiplication. And it's like you make a decision at this point, okay, how do we become where we know that they are probably not going to be able to recite it like we used to, or even the class before them. But how can we make it to where they can use some tools and some strategies to be able to do this higher level math, knowing that there is still a significant gap in that foundational skill. And so it is that time that they lost, but it's also what occurred virtually during that time. My son laughs and says, not everybody got to be quarantined with a principal. And I'm like, well, sorry, because I knew how to pull our state standards and stay on track. Other people
Right.
had to go to work. I was home with him too.
We're getting so many great questions in the chat, and I'm going to try to get to as many as possible. A few people have brought up screens. And I think we can add that, think about this as both from the perspective of phones in schools, where kids are bringing their device into schools, and then schools giving a device to kids. I mean, I'll start with you, Ashley. Like, where are you at about screens in schools? Do you think what is your current policy? Have you tried to roll back the student screens, even the school screens?
So this is the first year in Alabama that we have what's called the Focus Act. And so students cannot have their personal communication devices on them from the moment the first bell rings till the end. My district already had a policy in place like that. We didn't let them have cell phones, but we are a one-to-one district with Chromebooks, but you can walk in our classes now and the Chromebooks are under the desk. We are back to just face-to-face direct teacher instruction and using the school as a resource, not the only method for instruction that they got so accustomed to.
What are your thoughts on this, Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such an important question that we are probably not, I think we will know a lot more in a year, particularly about the phone ban piece. So, the first kind of academic paper that I've seen about phone bans has come out using some data from Florida. I don't think it's perfect, but it kind of suggests it suggests sort of two things, which my guess is we will see more generically. One is a bit of an increase in test scores sort of 2 years in. And the other is an increase in behavioral issues in the first year. So they sort of highlight some of what people worry about with the phone bans initially, which is like the teachers are going to spend all their time being like, put away your phone, put away your phone, put away your phone, you're suspended. And so I think they saw a little bit of that in the first year. It kind of went away in the second year. In the second year, they saw some increases in test scores. So I think there's many more states that have gone for something like this Focus Act, like some kind of bell-to-bell ban. My instinct about phones in schools is that it's not great to have something pinging, children 27 times an hour with ESPN scores or whatever when they're supposed to be learning math. I think it seems pretty obvious. I think the screens question is a bit more complex because, of course, we know from some data that like well used, individualized learning opportunities can be like, if you use this thoughtfully, there's a lot of ways you can use it to kind of effectively shrink class sizes or, allow more individualized instruction and so on. When we're just, I know that some kids in my children's class watch basketball on their Chromebooks during biology, and like that's not really great as a time thing.
It really doesn't matter the blocks we put in place. We have some very tech genius, and so we try to spin it into get them on our tech hub team, and like how can they pre-teach us how to help ourselves? And so yeah, you're exactly right there. But
I think that's I think that sometimes we have people that say, well, we'll block certain websites and stuff. It's like these kids are a lot smarter than you.
Oh, yeah,
I'm sorry. There's like 50 YouTube channels about how to get around your school's website block, like that you don't know about. Like, we're too old for that's not going to work for you. Forget
We
it.
try to employ them on our tech team as to how can they help us be proactive with some things, and that has been good for us.
I like that. That's a great plan.
Can we talk about and there have been some questions about this, the massive surge of absenteeism, chronic absenteeism post-pandemic? Like, I would love both of your thoughts on like what is driving that, how much of these results are explained by that, and what to do about it. Emily, you go ahead.
Yeah, it is a great question. So I think it seems hard to know how much of the results, these results are driven by the absenteeism. Maybe some. I think probably you could do some back of the envelope to figure it out. I think that it is very clear we have way more absenteeism than we did, and I don't know how much of that is people almost like getting the impression that school is optional, like that it's optional, but sort of giving them the idea that, like, school is like, we canceled it for a year. Like, what's the big deal? And I'm not sure that that's really what's going on, but for sure there has been some change in the way that people have thought about the necessity of attending school, which does not seem good to me. It cannot possibly be good.
Ashley, what have you seen and what do you think explains it, and what have you tried to do to get kids back?
So we coming back, it's really interesting how you almost have to market your school. You have to market that your brick and mortar option is better, or can be beneficial to your child who has these learning needs compared to all of these other online options that have opened, or schools that have the flex schedules. We also have to just market the fact of what we have going. Brick and mortar, come to school 5 days a week, is just it's just as beneficial to your student, and that attendance is not negotiable. Because when we came back on that hybrid model, if a kid got sick and they were one of the ones, I mean, I remember coming into the classroom and having to measure the desk and say, oh, you were sitting within this radius, you go home for 14 days, you this, you that. And so it almost became negotiable then. And now it's like, no, I need you in school. And we're still, I mean, chronic absenteeism is part of one of our federal and our state report card indicators. And we just have a very little control over getting a child to school. And so we fight it both ways. So it's kind of a marketing piece now. Hey, we have all these great things. Please come, please come. And then ensuring those great things are happening. And then to say it is not just a compliance piece. In order to give your child all these great resources, I need them here, and I need them here all the time. It is still a battle. It is still, in fact, my school alone increased our chronic absenteeism 4% last year. And we're asking our question right now, why? Why?
Let's talk briefly about the NAEP versus state test data. Emily, do you want to pull that up?
Yeah.
So people can see. So recall, there's this moderate correlation. And I'll just note before you pull that up and comment, Emily, that I think we do have to be a little careful about comparing different states' proficiency changes because they have different tests and they have different cut scores. So we wouldn't want to look at one state and say they went up 10 percentage points or 5 percentage points, and another state where they went up or down 2 because they have different tests. I think we should sort of look at it directionally. But directionally, we see, for instance, like Illinois and South Carolina, they lost ground on NAEP, but they gained ground on their state test. What do you make of that, Emily?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's worth saying, these are measuring different things. They're measuring sort of different sizes of the population. The tests aren't the same. So, it's not, I think they're both useful, and we wouldn't expect them to line up one to one. It is when we look at the outliers here, I think I would want to understand a bit better, particularly if that were like a sort of outlier in a kind of consistent manner. So, to see even a place like Arizona, which is kind of down 7 points on the NAEP and is a little bit up on their state tests, kind of suggests to me that, like, you may not be measuring the same thing. And I think it's worth thinking about, is the NAEP really poorly matched to the curriculum? And so it's just kind of like measuring noise, or have you sort of changed something in the state tests in a way that like maybe it's not visible. It doesn't seem very visible, but there's some smaller change that again, like has made the test perform in some different way. So I'm not really sure I'm not entirely sure how to organize it.
I think also to step back at a national level on NAEP, we don't see a ton of recovery. In reading, we see further
Yeah.
declines between 22 and 24. In math, we see no recovery in eighth grade, but some recovery in fourth. Whereas on the state test, in every state, we're seeing recovery in math. In most states, we're seeing recovery in reading. So they are painting a different picture of where we are as a nation. And maybe the answer is somewhere in between. I don't think we should totally throw out the state test and just say, oh, we only trust NAEP. But there are other reasons the state scores may be a bit more inflated. If either of you, Emily or Ashley, want to comment on that, go
I'd
for
be
it.
curious what Ashley has to say.
So in Alabama, our NAEP, you are selected randomly if you're going to be a school that gives NAEP, and then you are sent the list of students. And there's not really a subgroup breakdown. And so the students, number one, don't really even know why they're going to take this test. They just know they got this letter and they were selected. And then they go take this test with a administrator for the assessment that has been brought into the school. So there's no like relationship meaning to this person. They don't really even know why. It doesn't matter how you try to explain it to them. I mean, we talk ACAP all year and we talk this, and that's one picture point. And so to me, it's just, while I think the NAEP's great and what it assesses is like a satellite view to where all the pieces are, our state assessment is specific to what we're teaching. And while it doesn't have an accountability measure for a kid if they're going to move grade levels or they're going to move this, they do know people are looking at it and they can go down to the specific standard that it assessed and say, hey, when you were sitting in Dr. Boland's class, you did this and this is what you scored on it. So I think a lot of it is just, what does it really mean to our kids? Because we give it at a random selection like that.
Scott Marion, who I believe was on the NAEP governing board, chimes in. I'd be careful not to dismiss the NAEP results. There are a lot of changes with state tests that we don't always see. I think this
Yeah,
is.
I mean, I think that for me, that's like, there's also a question about like, I think looking at this graph and looking at what's going on, what's happening with the Illinois point, that is a place where I look at this distinction and I would say like, that makes me want to look a little more about whether there's something we're missing about what happened at the state testing level, because, that's such an outlier. And the finding on the NAEP is like, seems like plausible. And, an increase of 20 percentage points is way outside what we typically see in terms of like changes in like, that would be an astonishingly important increase in sort of state, like in just proficiency rates. And I think we would expect to see that show up in the NAEP.
I tell our students here that a picture's worth 1,000 words, and a picture is made up of all these little pixels. And NAEP is one layer to that. And it kind of tells us trend-wise how we're doing from state to state. And maybe we should call our friends in other states and say, hey, how are you implying the science of learning here? What does that look like in day to day? Because you can get into theory and walking the walk. And I think that all of it is a good, just pixelated part of really that makes up a kid that comes to school every day.
For the record, I have asked the Illinois State Board of Education about this, and if you want to know their answer, you can read my newsletter later this afternoon.
I like the suspense.
Oh my God, Matt is like, he's making us work for it.
Here's the carrot.
I don't know.
Here's
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to fully
Okay.
answer the question.
I'm signing up right now, Matt.
Excuse me. So let's talk about some solutions, and there are some questions in the chat about this, and also, this is a time where resources are more constrained. The COVID relief dollars are mostly over. So there aren't silver bullets here, but I love either of your comments on like, well, where do we go from here as policymakers, as educators to try to continue to make progress?
So I'm going to say two things. One, I think is sort of obvious, and one is something I think we aren't talking enough about. So in general, when I look at the cross-state data, it looks to me like there's a fair amount of variation across states, and you can see that in the NAEP, you can see it in the state test scores. Like there are some states that are doing better. think one thing that everyone talks about, the thing that's sort of obvious, is the question of phonics and how important is phonics. And I actually think there's still quite a bit more work to be done to understand what to do about that beyond just being like phonics is important. Like, yeah, phonics is important, but that's actually different than saying here is the precise curriculum you should use, or here is what's going to work in schools of your type. And often implementation is different. Phonics is not one thing. It's not like, it's not just one thing. There's not one way to do it. And so I think there's like way more work to be done in terms of thinking about implementation. I'd like to see more data, across districts. People asked in the chat, like, can you do more about differences in curriculum? Sure, data on like what curricula people are using is very poor. There's more like academic work to be done to understand that. So I think that's clearly a piece of this, going beyond just the knee jerk, like phonics is important, into like, here is what places are doing that works, seems crucial to me. I think the second thing is I would love us to have a better way to learn from like individual successes in different ways beyond the kind of like phonics thing. So can we find schools or districts that are outperforming their demographics, right? Like schools that are and districts that are doing well conditional on the population that they have. Or, go to the states that had, like, Mississippi is unusual in their math recovery, at least in the state test scores. I'd be, in addition to me in ELA, I'm curious to ask, like, did you do something that was like more interesting that we might understand? So I just think there's more that could be done to look at successes and learn from them. And that requires a little, almost like just being in the data and be like sort of finding places and being like, what did that place do? What did that principal do that was successful?
I'm glad you ended with that, because that's absolutely what we do. We go to Parka and we look at what are schools that look like us doing. And I like how you said it, we're outperforming our population. I think the other thing that is just so powerful for us is building back in the system of school and getting out of that. When we came back from COVID, I remember 327 of my 700 students, based on our first little assessment we gave them, were reading 3 or more grade levels below. And I'm asking secondary content experts to go teach foundational reading skills that they did not have the pedagogical knowledge to do. And so we really had to shift that narrative from COVID didn't affect everybody the same. And so, but what we can assure you is that we can grow, and we can grow, and growth is going to look different. And we had to make the student part of that feedback loop for, this is working for me, this is not working for me. And they had to become an active person. And instead of just, I taught it, they should have learned it. But I did not, I got lost in this, and this is how. And so kids became part of the feedback loop. We had to instill that just core instruction at a systematic level, and we had to remove the excuses. Okay, it happened. What do we learn from it, and how do we move forward? And really, more than ever, a growth mindset played a huge part, because the gap was large.
We have a number of questions about like different ways of cutting the data. And I think we probably don't have the answers to most of them. Like, were girls more affected due to school closures? I will say, for reporters on the call, I've worked with Emily and her team before to try to answer very specific questions. And as I understand, Emily, you all are open to working with reporters to try to cut the data in different ways. And so I think that is like just a really terrific resource. And there are so many ways that we can look at it. There are also questions about grade level, which I think is another rich question. And the good thing about this data relative to NAEP, and I'm sorry, Scott, I'm not saying anything bad about NAEP, but
NAEP's great, Scott. We love it. Thank you for being here.
Exactly. It's a bigger sample size, though, with the state test data, so you can actually cut it in a bunch of different ways and still have a meaningful sample, unlike NAEP. There was one question about a data cut that I did want to ask about, though. Emily, have you looked at anything about family income and learning loss? Like, did lower income students lose more?
Yeah, so when we did, this is not in this, when we did our sort of paper on this, what we saw was income, not so much; race, yes. So Black students in particular were both more likely to be in districts that were closed, and the effects of closure there were larger. So we actually saw like the sort of loss across racial groups was more, although a lot of it was about just differences in like what kind of school closure people were exposed to.
There was also a question about trends before the pandemic and some stagnation or learning declines even pre-pandemic. I think the question was, how do we differentiate between the pre-pandemic trends and what we're calling learning loss? I think the answer is we can't fully disentangle the two, but I do, you can speak to that, Emily, and also like broadly, like what might have been going on pre-pandemic.
The average changes in these scores pre-pandemic were not real big. So like to the extent there were some, I think there were maybe some occasional trends in the NAEP and other things, but in the state test scores, they're mostly pretty flat. I mean, at some point we had a graph of like how much the test scores changed between like 19 and 21 by state. And then how much the average like changes, change between like 15 and 16, 16, 17, 17, 18, 18, 19. And those numbers are very small on average relative to the pandemic. So, is there a little bit of trend before? Maybe. It's pretty clear that the pandemic was a big delta everywhere, not just places that schools were closed.
I think
Go ahead, Ashley.
I just think the pandemic made everybody and I'm not saying that all schools don't have gaps. Based on the population you get to serve, sometimes you're always discussing filling a gap. And when you came back post pandemic, everybody had gaps. And some schools that had never experienced gaps had to become part of that conversation and at a level that maybe they had never had. And that was interesting as an educator to hear peers discuss things that while we knew existed in other places had not hit home yet.
That's very interesting.
There was a question that was pre-submitted that was, what are the limitations of our standard learning measures? There was also another question, a pre-submitted question about how do we bring joy back into the classroom beyond test measures. So, maybe Ashley, you can speak to how you think about the balancing act of like these tests are important, but also maybe they're not capturing everything.
It's funny you say that because at the beginning of the year when we had our data day, we had already looked at our precursor data and had determined that we didn't have the growth we wanted. Actually, we were 3 points lower in our growth area last year to this year, but we looked at like our discipline data, and we were significantly lower in our discipline data. And so last year we did a big shift on building the best Falcon and what that looked like. And we knew we might take some hits academically, but we had to bring back the joy of wanting to be at school and wanting to, because you have to build a relationship with a kid for them to go on the productive struggle with you academically, or they're the least bit interested. And we know in middle school, you see a drop in 7th grade anyway, or any year you've got a transition, you're going to typically see a little slide. And we are that 7th grade year. So we deal with a lot of things, and that is, they transition new to my building. So it is all about bringing that joy back in school. And I'm just really glad that one data point doesn't get to define me, because I don't know if was my best self that day, what had happened to me before I got out of my car, what happened to me before I got on my bus. And so I do think that educators just have to, it is one part of the blueprint to building a fantastic kid.
I should note we have two excellent commentators, Scott Marion and Hema Zamaro at the University of Arkansas, who have commandeered the Q&A to offer resources. But there are actually excellent resources that I would recommend folks take a look at. Some helpful research about pre-pandemic achievement and a summary of research about COVID and schools, I believe Hema worked on. Emily, have you looked at the learning loss data in other countries and how the US compares?
Yeah, we looked at that when we were sort of first looking at this, and the answer is like many countries lost some learning, but our school closures were much larger than many places. So a lot of, the places we think of as our kind of peers in the space, like in Europe, saw like they sort of closed in the spring, but then they kind of reopened in the summer. And so because their term was different and their approach to this was different. And so there was there's some good evidence from Germany, the UK, of like that sort of spring, less learning in that spring of 2020, but then it's just like not that long a time period. And then they kind of came back. I think, I haven't seen as much from some of the Asian countries stayed closed for a very, very long time. And I haven't actually seen much out of that. I don't know if you see that in the TIMS or in the whatever is the relevant.
I think what's interesting is, so I think the two big tests that people have looked at are PISA and TIMS. And I think on TIMS, the US looks worse than most other countries. But on PISA, the US looks a little bit better, especially in ELA. And they're different tests. The PISA is high schoolers, TIMS is eighth graders. And so I don't think we really know what's going on. I think it is clear that pandemic learning loss affected many other countries, as we would expect. Maybe by some data, the US is a bit worse. So I'm not quite sure about that. There was a question, I think it was a pre-submitted question about fourth versus eighth grade reading. And have seen some really compelling data in fourth grade from the so-called Southern Surge states, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Louisiana. But the data, the gains have been a little less strong in eighth grade, and in some cases there haven't been gains in eighth grade. Ashley, do you have any thoughts on like how to translate success in fourth grade to eighth grade, and why maybe it hasn't, or maybe it just like we need to wait 4 more years?
I don't, the curriculum is so different from fourth grade to eighth grade. You still have a core reading piece that you're teaching in fourth grade, and that shifts to almost a comprehension based and looking at things at a standard level. And I just think the lens we look at reading, we start looking at text-based evidence and how can you write and how can you form arguments. And like, for example, today in my English class, they're having court as their argumentative essay, and then they'll write their essays from that. If you walk into fourth grade reading today, they're probably doing a core reading curriculum lesson. And so it just looks very different. And so I don't know. I know that may not even be a great answer, but I don't know that you're ever going to see it apples to apples, because it's not. Because what you're doing in fourth grade with reading and what you're doing in eighth grade with reading is very different.
Yeah, sounds right.
I'm just going through our last questions. We just have a couple more minutes. Another person writes, in Philadelphia, we've seen recovering math scores and stagnant ELA, and we've been attributing that to our specific curriculum choices. Should we be reassessing whether this is just a national trend and not something our district is specifically is doing? Which goes back to the sort of ELA and math. I mean, I think it is a national trend, but I think a district should
Could also be what you're doing.
Yeah, right.
Could be both, right? I mean, I think it's like, other people could also be choosing their curriculums in a less good way. I think it's also, again, like there's a question of what's the curriculum and how is it being used, and how long does it take for teachers to get up on this, and how easy. I mean, this feels complex.
I think it is complex. I mean, so many times when you get a new curriculum, the adult learning aspect of it is left out. And so it's like, hey, here's this new thing, go teach it.
Right.
But we didn't really go through the system, the structure, and the process to train our adults to be able to replicate that to fidelity with our kids. And not all our adults are virtual learners either. So it's great that these curriculums have these toolbox you can log on to and all that. But the initial learning, I think we have to think about our adult learners in the room when we roll that out.
And I think this is a place where I would say, like, my guess is if you looked across schools in a district, when you did a curricular rollout, you would find some do it, some are much more successful than others. And that's where you got to say, like, okay, what did the principal do? Like, what did the school, and my guess is that you have enough variation in the school, you're going to find like the 5 most successful schools, particularly conditional on demographics, did the following training for teachers, or had the following experience, and then that's something you can learn from. In this place, we're not exploiting these variations probably enough.
I am just going to do one more quick question, trying to get through as many Q&As as possible, and then we will wrap up. This question was, an education economist recently observed that under his model, the average student who was in K-12 during the pandemic will have 5 to 6% lower lifetime earnings. Do you agree with that? I mean, that's
I think that's like, I mean, like I understand how you get, I myself am an economist, and I do understand how we get to those numbers, which is sort of, we look at learning loss, we look at sort of test scores and their relationships to wages, we think about other things. The reality is like, it's really, really hard to kind of make any precise numbers, and a lot of whether that happens or not is going to depend on other things that go on. If all of a sudden we got like really good at like helping people recover and at like vocational training, and we sort of figured out how to like generate, good jobs for everybody, then probably we won't see that kind of impact. So this feels like, like if you had to guess, is that a terrible guess? On average, probably not. Does it come with noise that allows for both large positive and large negative impacts? Yes,
And it may reflect, to your point, policy choices that we continue
absolutely.
to make about education as well as the labor market.
Yeah.
Guys, we are out of time, but this has been terrific. I really enjoyed this conversation. I want to thank you, Emily. I want to thank you, Ashley, for this rich conversation. And I want to thank you all. At our height, we were at about 150 people wonking out about this. The questions and answers were just absolutely terrific. I wish I could have gotten to all of them. I also want to thank our sponsor, the AIM Institute, for helping make this happen. There will be a post-webinar survey that you're welcome to fill out. I also encourage you to join Chalkbeat newsletters on the off chance that any of you are not signed up to all 10 of our newsletters, and follow Emily's team at Parent Data and the Education Data Center. Thank you to everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Matt. Thanks,
Terrific.
Ashley. So great to see you.
Yes, thank
Bye,
y'all so
y'all.
much.
Thank you.